are. I am with Anne Yeoman from Brookside. Hi, Anne.
Hello, Langley.
It's really good to see you. And I know when we talked about doing that, there was no such thing as the series title. That came later. When we talked about sharing faith, you were very keen. History and guiding was a big one.
I was a brownie from the time I was 7. Could have been a little bit earlier because I think you could start at 6, but anyway, from 7, I think it was. And I retired at just over 60. Right. And I had served 40 years as an adult with they don't call it a commission any longer, but that's in effect what it was. So I started off as a lieutenant and became a captain. And then everybody became just a guider later on. And so I learned to do wonderful practical things that have been useful all my life, like darning, plaiting, which for somebody with short hair is a skill that you don't naturally pick up. I've always had short hair. And things like I can rope something onto a car because I learnt knots.
Right, yeah.
I do other things as well, but I can light a fire with 2 matches out of doors. I know where to find dry wood. It's those sort of skills I have actually found very practical. Never had to skin a rabbit or anything like that. I'm not that old, but there was a point at which older guides were expected to catch a rabbit and skin it. We don't. Things have changed a lot since I was young, and I went on. I was a guider. I was a ranger and young leader guider. Young leaders are girls who are learning to be leaders from the age of that. I think they start at 14 now. And I was a county camp advisor and a county arts advisor. And I was a regional arts advisor, which is Anglia. It's quite a big chunk of England. And then I became a trainer. Train adults, and eventually I ended up training trainers and assessing them. So I learned a massive amount through guiding, but one of the big things I not learned because I already had it to a certain extent, but I developed faith.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
I think a lot of people have the experience that in going to camp and sort of living in the outdoors and worshipping in the outdoors, a lot of people have experiences of coming very close to God in that way. So it's not just me. But I did find that, and I particularly found that when I was leading worship in camp, it meant a great deal to be not teaching, because that wasn't the point, but to be encouraging girls to feel the presence of God where they were, and that has anything you do for other people helps you to learn yourself, doesn't it? So learning to tell stories, for instance. I tried to use one last night actually that I had used with girls, and I tried to read it yesterday, and it made me cry. Like I couldn't read it without crying. It moved me so much. Whether it moved other people as much as that, I don't know. But I do remember a few of the things of the illustrations I used, and we sang a lot, of course, and we always included things which had a spiritual content. Even in an ordinary campfire, when we were doing some quite funny things, the odd things like Ginganguli and stuff like that, everybody laughs at. But we were also singing things with a spiritual content. And I think, I don't know, it helped to make faith part of a normal life, or a practical life.
Yeah.
Yeah, where it wasn't just for Sundays, it was for the rest of the time as well. And I think that's been a great help. And also, of course, being able to help girls develop themselves in lots of ways, practical and spiritual ways. It was also something that was very special.
So
I wasn't a Sunday school teacher, I have to say.
right.
I was much older. I did a spell. One of the things that I think I've experienced moments of really deep spiritual significance through my life.
Yeah.
I've experienced moments of desperate unhappiness as well. And the other the thing that's sporadic has been gifts. So I seem to have been given gifts in particular places, at particular times, which I've never really used again. Well, some of them I have, but it's almost as though everything has been in time slots.
I mean, there is a theology behind that says, that God gives us what we need when we need it.
Yes.
Which I'm actually probably more settled with than that's your lot. Here's your gifts, off you go. But if I can just probe a little, because what you say is really interesting. So we've had two kind of different forms of testimony. It doesn't surprise me that surfaced. One of them is the cradle. For Nick, it was the cradle Methodist.
Yes.
And then for Nikki, it was the out of church discovering God kind of Christian, then led into the Pentecostal church, then the Methodist church. So what was your experience? Because obviously you must have, it sounds like you grew up and faith grew within you steadily. Yeah. But was there a point of commitment for you, or perhaps talk about some of those high points?
There have been a number of that. So I was a cradle Christian in the sense that my family were Methodist, and my mother, well, she was a saint, really, to be honest. She should have been sainted.
We'll briefly sort of suspend our kind of our feeling towards. We'll welcome sainthood in this interview. Yeah, your mum was.
I know that she was a human being and she had human faults, but she was a wonderful person, and so she was the beginning of my faith. It wasn't. I'm sure I went to church very early on. I obviously don't remember that. I'm sure I went before I remember, and certainly I was baptized as a baby. But she taught me hymns and sacred songs because she sang all the time. She was had a beautiful contralto voice, which was trained, and she used to sing with chorus societies, and she used to sing solos in church and that sort of thing. She didn't do it professionally because she had the children, so that never arose. She had 3 of us in the end, and that was part of it. I always knew hymns, and we did this. She and I almost were telepathic. We did often start a conversation halfway through, because we knew we'd both be thinking the same thing. And one of the games that we used to play was to use a hymn in an appropriate place.
Right.
or a line from a hymn. Because we both, we knew the same hymns, obviously, very well. And as soon as she could, she sent me to Sunday school. But remembering that I was born during the war, and things were different, and we weren't living in normal circumstances. My father was posted to India. I'm not sure exactly when, but it must have been after my brother was conceived, and he was born in 1944. So we were there. She was on her own with 2 children, although at one point for quite a while we lived with my grandparents. Or we lived in part of their house. We lived separately in a flat above there where they were, but we saw them a lot. And my grandmother was also a Methodist, She was an organist. So there were more hymns, older hymns probably. And my grandfather was I don't know what he would have called himself, but he used to go to the Seamen's Mission in Brighton, where they were. And my other grandparents were also Methodists. So it's a pretty strong Methodist
well
background.
in the family. Yeah.
My father had been over churched. When he didn't have to go, he didn't as an adult. But my mother did. So when we moved to Harrow, we moved to North Harrow, and we started going to North Harrow Methodist Church. And she took me to Sunday school at the age of 5. There. And I stayed in Sunday school or junior church until I was 15, I think. It would have been, about 15.
Right, yeah.
When I moved somewhere, we weren't so close. But I started going to adult church then, all the time. So I had a good grounding in Bible study. And I found that really helpful because it's made it much easier for me as an adult to study the Bible in a more serious way, because it's just there. I've just things that I have known. Don't always know them right. You don't hear them right necessarily in Sunday school. You don't hear the whole story, do you?
No.
But it was a really useful background, as well as being part of the growth of my faith. And the other big influence in my childhood was a school teacher. She was my geography teacher. She was also our guider. She came to camp with us, and you get to know people in a different way. But she was a Methodist lay preacher.
Right, yeah.
And her faith and her caring, her love for people, just was obvious all the time. She was the sort of person that if you really had a problem, you could have gone to without having to think about it. You would have just gone to her for help. I never needed it then, which I'd known her later on, really. Well, I might have found her very helpful. So that was the beginning. A lot of it grew through guiding, and then when I was in my early 20s, I decided to become, I wanted to become a member of the church, and went to a membership class. That was quite interesting, in the sense that I met other people with different backgrounds.
Right, yeah.
And heard about them for the first time. So that was quite good. And some interesting discussions went on, which were things I would never have thought of. Somebody was working for I don't know, it was a brewery or a distillery, one of the other, and decided to give up her job, change her job because of what she learned in the class. So those things were really quite interesting and helpful, I think. I think, yeah, they added a layer. But I think at that point, I was still what I would call an intellectual Christian.
Right, yeah.
It was mostly in the mind. I believed it, but I didn't feel it. I mean, that's not completely, but I didn't feel it as deeply as I came to feel it later on. I married an Anglican, and we started worshipping in his church because we were living. Well, actually, he became verger of the church that he'd always gone to for a lot, well, since I don't know, his teenage years, and that became a joint church because the Methodist Church paid for most of the building of a new church, which was to be shared. So there was an old parish church, 14th century, that we were looking after, and this modern church. And we used to worship in both of them. And eventually, it wasn't very many years, the church became a joint church.
Right.
Not merely an experiment, but we actually joined our funds together. We were the first of the experiments ever to do that.
Yeah.
And it caused some problems, but administratively, but never among people. And that meant a lot. But it also gave me the experience of worshipping both sorts of services. I have to say that the Anglican Church was very low.
Right, I was going to say,
No bells and smells, but there were vestments and stoles, I think. Yeah, just stoles and altar frontals and things that changed. And and I washed the any of the linen, well, all the linen. I did all that bit.
right.
The clergy's job. And wound the church clock by hand.
Right.
Not always. And never when I was pregnant, but
Right.
otherwise. That gave me a sort of different view of church.
Right. Yeah.
And then we got involved with the charismatic movement, and that was my next big step. We went to a camp, and we did workshops and things. And there were things for the children to do. We were all there, and we was in a caravan. And then I think it was been a Saturday evening, there was a big service. A very famous preacher whose name I cannot for the life of me remember. I've been trying to think of it.
That's brilliant. That probably just shows you what a great preacher he was.
He was good, I can tell you. But after he preached, he said, well, anybody who has been affected by what I've said, who has been moved or has, I can't remember the exact words now. Well, they come forward. And I mean, loads of people did, I have to say. There were people who were committing for the first time. There were people who were recommitting. There were all sorts of things. And there were people who went forward for healing. And it all sort of happened at once. And there was a lot of that, you touch people and they fall down, the people to catch them. It was that sort of a thing.
Yeah,
massive marking. But I had been affected by something that he'd said. And I think one of the things he said was, if you believe, I can't remember all the details, but if you believe, you should come forward. You should, you should show God that you do. So, and I thought, I do. And I got up and went forward. I also needed healing, but I hadn't thought of that when I went. But when I was asked, I'd had a lot of slipped discs in my neck, a lot of pain, and I was still wearing a collar. And that was healed. And I was able to stop wearing the collar. I never wore it again after that. And I never have. And that part of it, of my arthritis, has never returned. So it's all over the rest of me, but it's not in my neck.
Not in the neck.
Which I think is just a continuing miracle. But it caused a problem because my husband confirmed. He was an organist. He was the virgin. He was at every wedding. He was, he was at every service. Something really upset him about me going forward. And he was going home, he told me. Well, he couldn't go home without us, as it was. So, I said, you'll have to stay until the morning because we can't just pack the children up at this time of night and go.
That's right, yeah.
And the next morning, he was intending that we would go home. He woke up early and he went outside and he heard somebody playing some music, which he particularly, I don't know what it was, but it was something that he particularly liked. And he decided to stop because he could hear the rest of the music and to be at and to stay for the rest of the day. And it changed him. It took a lot longer. It took the whole of that day before he was in a position to say, yes, I have had this personal experience of Jesus. So there was two of us and the children as well, actually, at the time.
Yeah.
So we know this. And we went back and just went back and joined back into normal church life. But not long after that, my husband decided he was being called to the ministry. And in 1980, we went to St John's College at Nottingham. And he did a 2-year course because of his age. He did a 2-year course and was ordained in 1982. And then we went into parish life. Being at college, particularly St John's welcomes families, and it welcomes wives to go along to lectures and to go to lunch and join in things. And I did as much as I could with two small children, or youngish children. And I had times when I'm not sure quite how to put it, but I think it was because of the different things that everybody brought to faith, that I had almost visions of different aspects of knowing Jesus. I would have said that charismatic occasion, I gave my life to Jesus in a new way. So I think I was born again when I was baptized. Got to believe that, because I believe that about baptism. And I was born again. That one occasion. So it's a sort of, I don't know. In theory, you can't be reborn too many times, can you? But
no,
there is a way in which that is true. And I then managed to hang on to my faith through some of the most terrible times in my life, really.
Well, let's pause it there, and then we can come back in the beginning, part 2, and we can talk about difficult stuff, and no doubt they'll end on a high note. But we need to go through that. We need to talk about the challenging stuff.